Right, thanks very much for coming. The main part of this talk is a well-illustrated account of our exploration over the last 10 years of the area around Tongue on the north coast. And by our, there have been 5 Highland naturalists, 2 of whom are present here today. That's the adventure, because it has been great fun. Probably the best way of getting to know an area like that, if you're not familiar with it, I had some familiarity but not in detail, is to list and map the higher plants, because after all, all flesh is grass. All the animal life depends on the vegetation. The vegetation also gives you very good clues to the geology underneath it, particularly when there's calcium or magnesium in the rock. Gives you clues to climate and the history of use by man, and so recording makes you look at all these relationships between animals, plants, landscape and that sort of thing. And the harder you look to get a reasonable species list out of an area, and reasonable in the context of Sutherland is 100 plus species, the better you understand that landscape. So with that in mind, please forgive a short introduction to the whys and wherefores of botanical recording. Just there's about 10 images and then we'll be on to the romp through the scenery and the species. Just looking at Britain as a whole, obviously there's a lot of information in what were known as the herbals, things from the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries and earlier on as well. But the first published account of the plants of a particular area, the first list, is not until 1660, when the Cambridge naturalist John Ray published written in dog Latin as it happens, and published anonymously a list of the plants around Cambridge. That was the first flora, as they're called, account of the plants that were found in a particular area, wild plants. The first records of plants from here, the northwest Highlands, are, including Assynt, are more than a century later than that. James Robertson, a young man in his 20s, was sent out by Professor John Hope from the Department of Botany at the University of Edinburgh in 1767 to, on horseback presumably, because there's no other means of transport, to survey the plants or list the plants of the Northwest Highlands. He did 5 years work, and he went all over Scotland. I think they were getting slightly worried that they were beginning to know more about the plants of the colonies, like across the Atlantic, than they did about the species that actually occurred in Scotland in this case. So that's when plant listing began to get beefed up. And curiously, his account of Assynt in particular wasn't published until 1994. It was his diaries were found in the library of the something of the Signet at Edinburgh. Anyway, and they were then analysed and not published till 1994, though those are the first records for Assynt in this area. That's listing plants in particular areas, and that went on and on and on. The first attempts to map records, so you could see on a map of the British Isles where things were, was not until 1873, when a chap called Watson devised a system based on the county boundaries of that time. And if he got counties that were too large, in his view, Sutherland, for example, was chopped in two, West Sutherland and East Sutherland, and those are known as vice counties. I'm the vice county recorder, and people sometimes ask which particular vice I'm interested in or whatever, but no, it just means a part of a county. Yorkshire, for instance, has got 5 vice counties. Those vice counties there are 112 in Britain, plus the Channel Isles as a separate one, and 40 in Ireland. So that gives you 153 units, which for many years were used for mapping plants. And people went on listing, and we still gather records using those vice counties, because although local authority boundaries change, those boundaries are set as in stone. West Sutherland is West Sutherland, stays just the same. I'm just going to do this one. Right. The 108 is West Sutherland, and although you won't see the boundary very well, East Sutherland is there, and the other one in the northern end of Scotland is obviously Caithness, over in the top, the northeast corner there. And this is the boundary running down to the Cromalt Hills. While we've got that map up, I would point out the lack of roads, in which you'll know very well. The western road, the middle road and the eastern road are the only roads that go right the way through the landscape. That's the one to Durness. This is the one with two branches, one of which goes up Strathnavor, and the one over there is Strathalladale. And then the boundary with Caithness is just to the east of that road. This makes for definite difficulties with survey, because there are parts of the ground in between the roads which are 10 kilometres off a road or track, and many of those have not been looked at in detail, as you'll see in due course. Right, West Sutherland, this is our patch, Assynt. Those are the 5 parishes which make up West Sutherland: Assynt, Edgerkillis, Durness, Tongue and Farr. Tongue is the smallest at about, I think it's 160 square miles in old money. Assynt is a bit bigger, 200 plus square miles. Farr is huge. And you'll know that during the 1990s, Pat and I surveyed this using the Ordnance Survey map squares at 2 kilometre, 2 by 2 kilometres as a unit for mapping, well, survey and mapping. And just remember that Ordnance Survey maps, although they go back to 1860, they didn't have a national grid on them until in effect after the Second World War. But there were some, I think, available in the 1930s with the national grid, and then they were all removed during wartime, so you couldn't get hold of maps in case they fell into foreign hands or something like that. And then it was after the Second World War that there was a grid on all the Ordnance Survey maps, and that's a 1 kilometre grid. And the first atlases the first atlas of the British flora, which I'm not illustrating, was started in 1950, and the fieldwork took 5 years, from 1955 to 1959. It was published in 1962, and that used 10 kilometre squares as their unit, and there are over 3,000 of those in the British Isles. That had the irritating effect that people sometimes came up here and recorded, for instance, parsley fern on Quinag, NC22, which is the 10k square which includes Inchnadamth, Quinag, and it took, that was 1966, and it took over 40 years for Claire Belshaw to rediscover where parsley fern was on Quinag in NC22. So that's a very coarse grid. We did Assynt at a 2 kilometre square grid with 164 units, and that was the first time any Highland parish had been surveyed at that scale. And we now survey normally at 1 kilometre square, what's called a monad. After Pat and I finished doing Assynt, as far as we were able in the 10 years that we worked on it, we continued work for the first 13 years of this century, through up to Durness and across to Loch Erriboll. We were very conscious, or we became more and more conscious, that we really didn't know much about Tongue and Farr to the east. A little bit of work had been done for a second atlas, but there were also other reasons for concentrating on Tongue, because we'd done projects on wildlife in Rogard and Scowry, but nothing on the north coast, and so we had a vague idea about a Tongue project, which was going to start off being the higher plants. Those are the 10 kilometre squares, 54 55, 56, 64, a little bit of 64 on Loch Loyal, 65 and 66. It's an interesting boundary that mostly follows water divides, and it is a confounded nuisance in places. For instance, here you've got a hill called Ben Stumina, which is part in tongue and part out, and right over in the north-east corner you've got the Inverness National Nature Reserve, which is split down the middle, but it does include the Kyle of Tongue there, and very good ground, Brown Ben Loyal, just off the Melonleith, Mealanleith, just off the east side of Ben Hope. So good varied country with Ben Loyal, the beautiful mountain, sometimes known as the Queen of the North, in the middle. There's a part of the map which is here, which shows our coverage at 1 kilometre square level. For part of that's the Kyle of Tongue, and just remember that I'll refer to that causeway across there. Before the causeway was put in, all the traffic had to go all the way around the Kyle on a single track road. It must have been quite a journey. Just a little bit about how we record. This is the boring bit. You can perhaps. We have a shopping list. It consists of abbreviated scientific names with which I have been working for 60 years now, so I'm very familiar with them. And it's got 280 of the commoner species on it, ferns and their relatives, grasses, sedges and rushes, and the rest. And we find that quite useful because it means that the sedges and rushes and things are not dispersed right through the alphabet, so to speak, and very useful to have the ferns together. So, and that's a recording form that we take out in the field, just cross off. The letters are extra information about habitats. EWL means edge, water, lake, or loch, I should say. On the other side, this is a fair copy. That was a field sheet. This is a fair copy of the recording sheet. We say where we've been, Clibrec, east of. We've got the monad, the date, who's doing the survey. That's myself, Gwen, and one of our partners in survey called Rose Scott. These are the rare species, all of which are localised to 8-figure grid reference. We also, when we're out, this is the field sheet, and that's a fair copy, note anything else we can identify. And in this case, you can see rabbit, fungus, dragonfly, juvenile pied wagtail, gulls, grasshoppers, greenshank, anything goes down and gets recorded. And that's how it's written in the field, not always as tidily as that. And I do fair copies of those. Just all the higher plant records are put on a Excel spreadsheet. Avril Haynes did that for me for 8 years, and then they're punted over to Granton-on-Spey, where a good friend called Andy Amphlett, who comes and stays at Badnaban from time to time, actually uplifts them, converts them into suitable format to go on the BSBI national database, which now contains 19 million records of plants. One last general point: how do we choose where to go, apart from all the nice bits around the coast that we can get to? Well, Sutherland is lucky, and maybe almost unique, certainly in the Northern Highlands, to have been the subject of a huge survey called the it's a vegetation survey of Northwest Sutherland, is called, by a chap called Christopher Eyre, and he looked at the whole landscape over 10 years, everywhere that hadn't got a conservation designation like SSSI. He also didn't go up mountains very much, but those are his sites, and there are 3 reports with very detailed descriptions of what's on the particular sites, which are very useful indeed. He was a geobotanist. He got his PhD on Ben Hope, looking at the relationship between the plants and the geology of Ben Hope, which is quite complicated. But 4, 5, 89, those are probably small lochans. 4 is a habitat classification. That's the west side of the mouth of the Kyle of Tongue, and down bits of coast, 3 is coast and things like that. So we use those as a starting point and have revisited most of those sites in that general area. I'm just going to give you one or two, well, where we've got to get it out of the way, because it sounds slightly vainglorious, but over the last 10 years, in about 20 one-week visits, we've listed 241 kilometres squares, so we average about 20 to 25 per visit, 1 or 2 a day, and since there are 4 of us altogether, myself, Gwen, Rose Scott and Gordon Rotherow, who's the bryologist that's been coming up since 1992, sometimes we divide forces, some go high, some go low, etc. I basically stay low nowadays. We've accumulated in that time some 30,000 records of 656 species, which is interesting because it more or less corresponds to what Pat and I got for Assynt in 10 years full time. So 21 week stops with 4 people, and it's a comparable number of records. In addition, Gordon has recorded 5,000 records of bryophytes. We've put down but not yet entered 1,000 records of butterflies, moths and other insects. Many of the moths through moth trapping done by Gwen at where we were staying, and also the visits by Stephen Moran, who will be known to some of you. Just a general point, we had a little financial assistance early on with travelling expenses, but otherwise it's been done in our own time and at our own expense. We were very lucky to get the use of an old croft cottage at Reetongue for 9 years at £300 for the week. It had 2 small bedrooms, 1 large bedroom, a back kitchen and no dining room, and only 1 shower, which was a bit of a nuisance at times. And Gordon always had to sleep in his van, but that's by the way. That's the only money that's gone. We've done it for fun, and it's been enormous fun. Detailed accounts of each year have gone into a thing called the Highland Naturalists. That's the one for 2024, and I'm writing the one for 2025 at the moment. They're well illustrated. Unfortunately, at the moment, they're not available online. Right, I think that's all the introduction, and now I just want to go into a selection of sites and a selection of species over the 10 years, missing out 2020, but just 1 or 2 sites from each year to give you some idea, some flavour of the scenery and the interest of the area. A bit of fun, this. So, are you okay with the lights, or would you like those lights off? Can you see okay? It helps me if I can read my notes, which is great. Okay, Andy. Oh yes, right. That's where we got to. Those are the 1 kilometre squares, and the colour shows you how many species are recorded for them. And what it does point out is these huge areas in between the roads, which RSPB knows some of that ground. There have been wide-ranging surveys, but there's been none of this detailed work done, and we've done quite well in Tongue. Quite a proportion of our 240, did I say, 1 kilometre squares are there, and we're continuing. We're booked in again for this summer, and we'll get another 20 or 22 in different places. We have done all the easy stuff, and we've done all the plummy stuff around the coast as well, and etc. So that's the state of play with the colour indicating. Right. That on the left there is the little cottage, croft cottage with a barn attached, which had breeding barn owls that we stayed in for 9 years as guests, paying guests of Ian Macpherson and Margaret Ward, who used to live at Drumbeck House. So I knew her years ago, and they made us exceedingly welcome. Unfortunately, that's no longer operating. That's the Kyle, which is an intriguing bit of fairly shallow water that sand appears over most of it, and those are in the background are the Rabbit Islands. Right, that's another view from the garden of that property of the Rabbit Islands, which is the site for 2016 when we started work on the area that I'm going to talk about. The Rabbit Islands are intriguing. There are no rabbits. I don't know when they were there. They have in the past, at very low tide, very, very low springs, you are said to be able to drive sheep across. There haven't been any sheep on the island for a long time, so it's got a good growth of herbage, one kind or another. Two rocky islets separated by a sandy spit. Right, we were taken out to the rabbits on our first week of this adventure by the McLean family from Borgie, and they, that's Gordon, Gwen, myself, and in the back Stephen Moran, and the picture was taken by Roe Scott. So all five of us got out there. When we got out there, we split. Gordon and Roe took the eastern island, we took the western island, and you'll see there was a sort of split in between. We were towing a small, what do you call it? Dinghy. Yes. We were talking busily with the with the chap who was running the boat, which was the son of the family. Sometimes it was the grandmother, sometimes it was the her son, and nobody noticed that the rope had parted, and we had to return about a kilometre to pick up the dinghy and reattach it. You can't get a boat in close. That's why we needed the dinghy, and there's Roe and Gordon disembarking on the island. It's about 6 kilometres from Skerra, which has got a good harbour, and one of few on the north coast. That's the western side, with a nice variety of habitats. There's macha, there's rocks and crags and boulders and things like that. Whoops. And I've only just got one or two species to give you the flavour. That's biting stonecrop, which is on Stoer and Clactol, and they're growing on rock with no doubt a lot of sand, and also sea ivory. And the furthest that Gwen and I never got to the northern end of the Western Island, because I think we were on there for about 4 or 5 hours, but there was so much to do that we didn't get there. But one of the funny things we did find was this marsh with a huge bed of yellow iris, which did surprise us. And just a reminder, wherever you are in this area, you're within sight of that magnificent mountain. It is a lovely hill with this sort of crenellated ridge with about 4 peaks on it, and I'll show you towards the end our visit. There have been 2 visits to Ben Royal. I wasn't on the first one, and anyway that was in a previous talk, so I thought we'd that's the sand spit, rocky sand spit between the 2 islands, and I think I've just got one species which you see around here. It's sea rocket. I'm just I've got a note here, we knocked up 108 species on there, which wasn't bad given that it's extremely maritime, but there was quite a nice mix of things. And that was that is a plant which can survive, as it does on Tashnesi Beach, being completely covered with sand, and then it'll pop up 2 or 3 years later when the sand gets blown off again. 2017 was quite an interesting year. We did do the survey, but this is a lady called Abby Rhodes, unfortunately no longer with us, who was, she was a caver. She's a Yorkshire woman. She was a caver. Enormous enthusiasm and dedication to what she did, which was mostly bird ringing. She had rung the complete range of birds of prey in the North Highlands, from merlins, which she'd run 100, I think, birds, or birds from 100 nests over a period of years, to sea eagles. She was enormously enthusiastic, energetic, and lived at Strathtongue with her husband Gary. Sometime during the winter of 2016-2017, we came up with the idea of a possible wildlife group up on the north coast to balance those at Tain and here in Assynt. And Abby and Gary hosted a meeting on the 1st of March and then another one on the 10th of May, and there was founded the Tongue, Melness and Skerrow Wildlife Group. So it was going to be rather local. That's now known as the North Sutherland Wildlife Group. And when it was converted to the North Sutherland Wildlife Group, Andy will remember that he managed to get quite a substantial amount of funding to buy equipment and get it started, and it's still running. It runs on Facebook, I think, and is very active. Not so much in meetings, but certainly active in gathering together observations. So that's Abby Rhodes. She was still ringing birds, but she latterly, when we met her, she was just getting into flies, and she acquired a competence, a remarkable competence. Dipterists, fly experts, came from all over the country to stay at Strathtongue with them and work with her, and she did very well indeed. We held, Gwen and I and Stephen held 3 field meetings that summer, separate from our survey. This is a lovely area called Lamigo. There's a track leading down to it from a house where a couple called Lockhart have been living for 40 years. They were both, I think, teachers, and they have a croft, and it's one of the most delightful spots and tucked away spots on the north coast. So that's Lamigo, and that's where the first, I think it was called a spring flower wander, or sort of wildflower wander, that's right, was held. And there are 4 of the people who attended that first meeting: Meg Telfer's an artist, Graham Crittenden's a lepidopterist, Irene Joyce was a botanist, now no longer with us, and that lady, I have her name but I've forgotten, Marilyn McFadden was just a local with an interest. So that was after we'd been down, looked at the flowers and come back and were enjoying our lunch. So that was the first of a series of field meetings. The second one was down from Tongue on a footpath that leads to Castle Varrick, and there are some magnificent meadows there. This was an insect meeting, but led by Stephen, and it was just one of those days when the honeysuckle was in full flower and all sorts of pollinators, and as we went down towards the valley over to the right there, we paid our respects to a very good standard greater butterfly orchid, and then we went across the bridge, around the corner, and Stephen set up shop, and there are 4 generations of naturalists. I'm the grandfather, he's generation, that's Stephen on the right, and that's Connie Gordon, aged 7, and her mother. Connie was very interested. We had 1 or 2 other people as well, they're the ones that got into the photograph. She also, she had the loudest voice for a 7-year-old I've ever met. It was rather intriguing. And she's still interested. She would now be, 18 or something like that. And she's set for a career, I think, in environmental matters. Her parents have the crofts, farm and crofts, and they maintain those fields, the ones with the orchids, in the old-fashioned way. They cut the hay late, that sort of thing. So that was the insect meeting. And the 3rd meeting in August was down on Melness Beach, where we were doing beach combing for shells. And that's only part of a large number of people, including children, dogs, or people who came along to that one. I attempted to get some of the children who found really nice things to just let me have one specimen for checking. I didn't get anywhere. They all took their shells away with them, but I had a very good day. So that was the starting point of the North Sutherland Wildlife Group, and it is flourishing, and we still occasionally lead meetings, field meetings. Stephen's visit in July, on his way home, he popped into a large conifer plantation only about half a kilometre south of where we've been staying, at Reeton, as it's called, north of the village, and came across this a population of creeping ladies' tresses orchids, at last recorded there in 1958. Nobody had seen them and noted them between 1958 and 2017. And Gwen and I went along a few days later, and she photographed them close up. Those are either pollinators or else they've got stuck inside the flowers, but they were part of the, they're natural. It's a curious orchid. It's got a spiral spike, and the flowers are furry, as you can see. That has occurred once in Assynt. Somebody, I can't remember his name offhand, but Mike Donaghy, I've remembered it, found one spike on the main path leading up Quinay, which must have come in on some walker's boots, the seeds or something like that. It occurred for one other year, and we haven't seen it since. So, creeping ladies' tresses, it's a very rare orchid up here. It's much commoner in the Cairngorms, in natural pine forests and in pine plantations. Right, 2018, just one site I'd like to take you around. That's Highland, which is a limestone island in the middle of Loch Erriboll. And we were over there twice, and we went with John Burnett of Kempe, who works for the council. He was doing tarmacking Glenderry Bray a couple of years ago. And he has a lovely house on a corner in the middle of land now owned by Wildland Limited. The whole of the estate on the east side of Loch Erriboll is owned by Paulson or his trust. That island as well, but John has his own little patch with a red roof house, which you can see if you go up the east side of Erriboll when you're making towards town. So that's Highland Corrie. That's from the north end. Those are lime kilns, where presumably lime was burnt to make agricultural lime. There are ruins on that island, but it's not been inhabited by anyone continuously since the 1950s. There were 2 wild and woolly sheep which have got left there, and generally speaking, the herbage, that's not a technical term, is quite thick and dense, rather crowding out some of the plummier plants. There are 5 species of Asplenium, known as the spleenworts, on that island, because Hart's tongue is now classified as an Asplenium, and there are 4 other species, well, C spleenwort and 3 others. But I mean, that generally in Assynt is confined to the limestone, although we now know the places along the coast of Achmelvik and 1 or 2 other places. So the limestone there is very hard. I mean, it's that dolomitized limestone with magnesium in it that can tear your hands if you're not careful. So that was an obvious thing to look out for when we found it. As I said, the turf got rather dense because of no grazing, and so Gwen there, it was a rather miserable day, slightly miserable day, is in full riot gear or rain gear, and that was where we found a lot of the limestone flora. In particular, that's just one example, that's frog orchid, 2 rather nice dark frog orchids, and a number of other things as well. I'm not sure that Highland Corrie had ever been botanised. Ferreira didn't get out there for some reason, and so we may have been the first people to have ever done a list of that island. It was a lovely island. We did the northern half one year and went back to the southern half in another year. while we were sitting down for lunch, this is one of those happy snaps that Gwen took. We, not more than, I don't know, 10, 15 yards away, Gwen, something like that. They were pretty near, weren't they? Yeah, just a pair of otters, maybe a mother and cub. And it was a snap virtually, because we were having our lunch just looking out over the western side there. So that was rather nice. We were about to turn back across the middle of the island. We were only going to do half of it in that year, when we noticed this sort of bumpy ground with a lot of really up and down, rather curious. And we had a look at it and found a very good stand of adder's tongue fern, which is a nice thing to find. It's a very odd fern if you think about it, because he's got these totally undivided leaves. And it's not uncommon it's fairly uncommon in Assynt. It's spread around, and of course we get small adder's tongue as well. I later ascertained that the bumpiness of the ground was due to the fact that it had been used by mosquito, fighter bombers during World War II as practice runs for bombing the Tirpitz, because the island was roughly battleship shaped and a bit longer, but they'd actually used the island. And so back in the 40s, there would have been bare limestone there, and that was rather nice to tie that very curious bit of ground with what were in fact bomb craters. Right, now moving on to 2019, Niamh or Coombe Island, which is not far off there's the pier at Skerra. That's where you go, and so that's a very easy run across to a beach. Highland and Roan, pardon the pronunciation, Florinda. It was the inhabited island until the 1950s, and you can see the house, there are now ruins on there. I'm going to talk about Niamh first, and then Ron. We had 2 visits to Niamh in different years, and Ron, we just had the one visit. It's a lovely island. The geology is quite mixed, not to say chaotic, to a non-geologist. Sorry, Grant. And what you make for a beach over there. So it's a very short crossing. There's the beach with a very fine bit of macha behind it, although you can't see very well on that picture. Those cliffs are hung with great mats of prostrate juniper, the one that occurs in northwest Sutherland or northwest Scotland, and that's a particular habitat for it. We on both occasions we were there. Stephen was there making records. There have been no insects ever recorded. That island was inhabited in medieval times, it's thought. It may have been what you call a monkish cell or something, but it's certainly never been inhabited since, but it was grazed. It ceased to be grazed quite some time ago, with the result that the natural grazers have taken over. Those are field roll holes in tussock grass. So that was there must have been a very hefty field bowl population. There are also nesting bonxes, which I'd forgotten about, and one nearly parted. The top of my head, well, there's no hair, but whatever, on one occasion. But we had a good look over that island. Gwen went rather further than I did, and as a result of the lack of grazing, plants like Scots lovage there, which we find on sea cliffs, was growing just in the turf, together with oxeye daisies and lots of other things. That is not a sight you see very often in Sutherland or West Sutherland, as you know, because if there are sheep, then they nibble it right down. But the ground vegetation was very dense and very nice to survey. That was a particular species that occurred in some quantity. It's great in knapweed, and of course it doesn't occur down in Assynt. It gets as far as Kinloch Burby, Old Shore Moor, but it doesn't come down here. There's also a place at Far Bay where you get great yellow bumblebees on that. I've got not many insects and not many birds in this talk. I'm sorry about that. They'll have to come later. That's we had a number of butterflies on the 2 visits, and that's dark green fritillary, I think a female probably by the colour, on Angelica. This is a unique assemblage of plants found by Gordon Rotherow on some cliffs, which I wasn't there with him, but he took the photo, because there's dwarf willow, which is usually reckoned a montane plant, although it occurs 5 metres above sea level at Ned, at Duart, but normally it's way up in the hills. It's the little willow you find in the saddle at on Quinyag. And next to it, growing with it, is the fruits of spring squill, which is a coastal species, and that we don't believe there's anywhere else in Britain where those 2 species have been recorded next to one another. That was Gordon's find. On the second visit to Neve, the McLeans said, as a bonus, we were paying them for the use of the boat, but they were very obliging. So would we like to go round the island? We said, yes please, on our way back. And this is right up the north end, where there is a most magnificent sea arch, which you can see there for as long as it lasts. There are also a very interesting sea cave, all slanty, which we took the boat right into. Right, Eilean nan Rhone is a different kettle of fish for landing. It had I don't know what the population was, but there was something like 20 or 30 houses, so they were abandoned finally in about 1954. And the access to the island was up some concrete steps around the back of that rib, and then along a narrow path on a ridge with a handrail which is loose at this end, all of which gave us some cause for concern, me in particular, especially coming back. But we got on, we crawled up the cliff and teetered along the ridge and got into the centre of the island, and there are some of the houses, some of which have still got good roofs on them. A thunderstorm was coming in from the west when we were on there. We made a run for one of the houses that had got a roof still on it. What we hadn't noticed was that, of course, the sheep have been spending a lot of time in there, with the result that the sheep dung was up to about a foot below the windowsill. We just sat there while the thunderstorm went through, that's Stephen, and then the sheep tried to join us, and they were very surprised. And it came one look and whoo, out they went again. We did, with the amount of grazing that was going on, wild grazing, we got a reasonable number of species. I could probably find the answer, 140. It's not bad for a very maritime site, but it wasn't an easy island to botanise. Stephen had a great way with kids. While he was for about 19 years the naturalist at Inverness Museum, and he ran children's activities, and he was just very good. And this was Harry McLean, the grandson of the people who at Skerra Harbour, after we came back from one of those trips, and he was just showing him how to use the bug hoover, and Harry was really quite beside himself with Stephen was my best mate, and unfortunately he died on the 23rd of December 2024 very suddenly, and we miss him greatly. Right, this is a site that Andy knows, Freeskill, where there's grey seal pupping site. I'm not sure exactly where. It's an old shepherd's cottage there, which is now a bothy, and Gwen and I were asked John Burnett if he'd take us up there in his boat, and so he did, so that we could do a distance square, because there's quite a walk in to get to that site across the ground. I don't walk long distances now, And there's the landing beach, which is nice and easy of access. That's the lichen-clad rocks. Most of the botanical interest of that site, it has to be said, was along the coast. But we did get up as far as the house, which is, has got some quite interesting information, and you could see the peat diggings, the old arable areas and everything outside of it. I think, I'm just, Freeskill, where are we? It doesn't say how many. We knocked up a reasonable list, but it was all rather overgrown. When we got back to the beach, John said, would we like to go further north along the coast towards Whiten Head? And we said, yes, please. And there we are, looking quite pleased with the tail at Jess's back end there. The cliffs are quartzite at the base, topped by the rusty red fucoid beds, which you get round here, over in the limestone area. And if you look across, as we have for many years, the top end of Loch Erriboll, you can see these little black holes along the sea line, and there are at least 20 substantial sea caves, which I'd always wanted to see close up, and this was an opportunity. There's one that you can actually take a boat through carefully. You can see the rusty red fuco beds at the top and the quartzite underneath. And there's two more of the 20. And it's odd really, because quartzite's very tough stuff, and quite how it had become perforated as it is. And those go in quite a way, those sea caves. It's the best set of sea caves on the north coast, I think. And coming back, we were looking for places where we might make another visit and actually be able to get ashore. We would have got onto the beach there. Whether we could have got up the side of the waterfall, I don't know. That ground is mostly on quartzite, the basal quartzite, and it's not very interesting from a botanical point of view, but it is very striking from a scenic point of view. Right, we are cantering through now, 2021. We have been remarkably lucky with the weather most of the time, or we've forgotten the rainy days, which is possibly. And this was a magnificent day. We were on a promontory called Ardskinnit, which is off Melness on the east, the west side of the Kyle of Tongue, looking across probably there to the cottages where we stay, with the lump known as the watchtower behind, and I'll come back to that. That's Gordon, Roe and Gwen in summer attire. We had a magnificent day that day. We found 7 species of orchids, lots of Scottish primrose, which if you haven't seen it, that only occurs along the north coast of Scotland and Orkney. And it is one of our endemics. It's a species that occurs nowhere else. It has relatives in Norway, but they're not the same. It's a lovely plant. I know one site on the north coast which has 80,000 plants, but they don't all flower. It's a very remote point. But one of the things we did find on that particular day was Scottish primrose, and it's not uncommon along that northern coast. This is an interesting distribution of surveyors. Gordon, who was a serious climber in his youth and still goes in teetery sorts of paces, is up the top of a 40-foot vertical cliff with a very fine prostrate juniper there, and that's Roe being sensible lower down. And that was another part of that peninsula, which is one of the richest bits of ground in the whole of that coast. Curiously, it's got, I'm just trying to remember the name, there's a succulent, a sort of mesembryanthemum that grows down in Cornwall. Is it called Cape? Something or other, with big red flowers. And oddly, somebody's planted some up there to see if it survives, and it is surviving, not just there, but not far away. The same summer, 2021, we went to a variety of habitats. We like to do coast and inland and dull and more interesting, etc. This is a bog pool with obviously base flushing, because that's black bog rush, that grey stuff. And there's Ben Loyal in the background. It is a lovely hill. It's not high, but it's a lovely hill. And in amongst that is a subspecies of the early marsh orchid called Paul Keller. We do get that round here. It's the cousin, if you like, of the sort of salmon pink one, Dactylorhiza incarnata Paul Keller. It's a lovely thing. And so the black bog rush is the thing you go for in those landscapes. Wherever there's Lewisian gneiss, it may be leaking calcium or magnesium, and you get those. That is Coldbacky, and we actually stayed, well, it must be there, I suppose, or converted, that house converted last year, but we'll come back to that. That's the watchtower there, Highland ruin, and about 4 lumps inland are very curious, possibly Devonian, may be wrong about that, the old maps had Devonian, sort of conglomerate, obviously with some lime content. I wasn't on that trip because it's too steep for me nowadays, but Gwen, Gordon and Rowe went right round the top and came back along, I think, along the bottom of the crag there. I've got a copy of their route. And I've just got one speed. This was a Ferreira site. There is purple saxifrage right down at the road in the back here, or just along to the right there, and lots of other interesting things. And that's Gordon and Rowe. Rowe used to be with, it was SNH. She's a mammalogist. She was the editor of the Highland Mammal. Hello, somebody wants somebody.
Sorry about that.
And that's Gordon, and that's looking the other way, Coldbacky Beach and the Rabbit Isles. And the one species I got from it was limestone bedstraw, which is a slightly creamy bedstraw with just characteristics which enable you to distinguish it from heath bedstraw. Right, we're moving on. 2022. The bottom end of Loch Erriboll is a valley called Strabeg, the small Strath, as opposed to Strathmore, which is the bottom of Ben Hope. The fucoid beds with their lime and whatever in them run through parts of those outcrops, and that is some of the nicest natural woodland that I've ever seen, and almost completely unspoiled. It's now actually deer fence, which means that it doesn't even get that amount of nibbling. That was the 3rd time I tried to get to that site. The 2 previous times we were midged off, absolutely ferocious midges. There's the woodland again, and in it is the largest hazel I have ever seen. Absolutely colossal. Hazel's a good sign of fertile soil, often slightly base rich, and you can see that it's doing its natural regeneration. Somebody said to me recently, don't they need coppicing? No, I said, that's an English practice. For God's sake, leave them alone. They coppice themselves. The old branches eventually fall down, but it's the old branches that have got all the interesting Atlantic rainforest lichens on them. So if you cut those off, you lose the rainforest, and those are the young twigs. But I don't think I've ever seen a hazel as large as that anywhere else. And other plants that told you there was a bit of base richness. Wild garlic, which grows in various places, including Ned, glowflower, and we divided our forces on this occasion. Gordon and Rowe were up in the woodlands, we'd gone to the bottom of the woodlands and then out onto the valley where there are a mass of Scotch Irish butterflies, lots and lots and lots, in the purple moorgrass, interestingly. And then we got over to the river that runs up the valley and found one of those places where the Scots pine that was here about 4,500 years ago for about 500 years and extended right to the north coast. There's one of the basal bases of those Scots pines that were here for the 500 years that they were. It's no longer a native species in... That's it, thank you, Andy. Right, at the eastern end of the causeway across the Carlo Tongue is an island called appropriately Eilean Tunga. The main road is just to the right, and the good thing about this is that it doesn't get any grazing. So you get, those are all common species, but it's nice to see them in abundance and flowering. Angelica, hardheads or knapweed, etc. And rather rare rare in the context of Sutherland, a mass of sea aster. There's a little of that around the Loch Row at Achmelvik, but that it grows there in great quantity. And we've never seen such a good show. The following year, the geese had got it, but never mind. Right, the other thing I wanted to show you for 2023, we've only got 2 years after this, you'll be glad to hear. This is another Ferreira site. It was one of the places, one of the people who helps us when we're out is Ian Smart, who's been a keeper for 30 years up there under 4 employers, now working for Wildland. Very obliging, takes us by Land Rover, along stalking tracks, occasionally by Argo Cat, more of that in a moment. That bit of woodland was one that he'd recognised, and we got to it. It was a long drive and then a short walk through rather with waist-high grass, and that's just in the woodland. And again, wherever you're in this scenery, you can see the top of Ben Loyal. Roe was the one who was up in the corner there in the woodland, and she got 2 very nice species, intermediate wintergreen and serrated wintergreen, meaning toothy wintergreen. Those occur in each of them in one place in Assynt. The intermediate wintergreen is in Glenanavati, and that one is on a crag on the south side of Camlock. But this was a new location. Nobody had ever seen those plants there before, and they'd actually escaped the attention of the man I think of as Eagle Eyes, Chris Ferreira. Right, 2024. This was the year. I've just got the one site here of our epic journey up Ben Loyal by Argo Cat. I don't know how many of you have ridden in one of these. I had fortunately advised Roe, I'd asked Roe, I knew she got an old caravan, had she got any of those linear cushions? Because I thought we might need them in the back, or they might need them in the back, because I was riding in the front. And that's one of the advantages of being a senior member of the party, only in age, not in any other respect. Okay, that's the Argo Cat with Zara, and Gwen, Roe and Gordon and the dog were all in the back, and I and the driver were in the front. We did 14k that day in an Argo Cat across some extremely bumpy ground, because he wanted to show us where the dwarf birch was regenerating so well with removal of all the deer from that estate, and there it is. Lovely tree. It's supposed to grow on Canis, almost certainly does. We can't really find it at the moment. Stuart Belshaw knows where it is, but I can't get him up there. It's got these like little cogwheel leaves. They're only the size of a fingernail. So there's lots of dwarf birch coming, and he wanted to show us all the patches in the rough ground leading to the bottom of the hill. We then came up one of these gullies and parked the Argo Cat, and then spread out on the stony ground, which is where a lot of the interest was. But it was on these patches we were wandering around that we found some of the interesting things. That is a montane hawkweed called Hieracium holocericium. That probably means extremely hairy, I think, and it is extremely hairy. It does grow on the tops in Assynt, but it's a very distinctive hawkweed. Hawkweeds on the whole tend not to be distinctive, and they're a specialist study, but that one we were pretty certain we got right. That's the fruiting stage of trailing azalea, which I'd never seen before. Lovely red fruits. It's the little thing that it's on the way up to Speed and Coinick and a number of the hills in Assynt, but it's usually fairly high. That is a rather splendid Arctic alpine lichen called Solarina croquea, croquea meaning orange, which is a mountain-top species. There are Solarinas on the limestone with those great black patches in them. There's one there, but that one we were pleased to find, not being lichenologists, but instantly recognisable. And finally, in this very small suite of things, and we had a good day on the top there. We had eagle, I think there was sign of mountain hare, and probably other things as well. This is a cup fungus growing on Vitis cowberry, and it's called the cowberry cup fungus, or Phycillospora viticidea. Viticidea is the scientific name of it. We took a sample of that, there was more than that, and took it down to Bruce Ing, who said, wow, he'd never seen it before in 60 years of doing fungi, and there are only 3 other records from Britain. So it's just one of these things, you notice it, you take a little bit and you find an expert, and we're very well served by expertise here, very fortunate indeed. And there it is, that's the 4th record for the British Isles. There's the crew other than Rowe who's taking the picture, and there's Ian on the right, and many thanks to him for expeditions on every time we've been up, and he's been extremely helpful and he's very interested. And there's the grassy ridge, which Gwen and Rowe and Gordon had been up the hill before to the castle, so-called. I'd never been up, and I was just rather intrigued. It's got very steep sides, but intrigued by the grassiness of it. Right, how are we doing? Yeah, right, nearly finished. Last year, 2025, when we moved to the palatial surroundings of Beach Cottage, Colbackie, with 3 bathrooms for 3 bedrooms. So no queuing and no knocking on the door. You've been there long enough, you know, that sort of thing. That's Gwen. Lovely. And there's Colbackie Beach. That's a lovely beach, and it has some very interesting rocky areas tucked in under here with all sorts of interesting plants. And there's the Rabbit Islands again, and in the background is now. On our way up, each year we go up, Gwen and I on the Saturday normally stop on the way right at the southernmost extremity of Tongue Parish or wherever to see what we can find in distant squares. And this was a very unprepossessing looking forestry plantation, felled here. This is reseeded, and then a lock called Lock of Void, MHOID, if that is void, or something like that. Mudge. Vudge, thank you. And at the foot of those, there's some little white flowers. That is so-called common wintergreen, the least common of the wintergreens in West Sutherland. And there were 6 plants, and the last time it was seen in that area was 1895, 1,000 feet up Ben Loyal, and nobody has seen it in that area since. The only other recent record is from Ben Hope. There's just 4 squares in the north of the county where it grows, and we have got to get in touch. We just discovered there's a person called a nature administrator who has joined the staff of the wildland, and that's a species I want to bring to her notice because it is extreme. Well, it's rare because it's got to be flowering, and there've got to be a couple of idiots who might recognise it, who happen to be in the same spot. There may be, like with all of these varieties, there may be other occurrences, but until you get the plant and somebody who can recognise it in the same place at the same time, you haven't got a record. We tend to ring the changes. A couple of days later, that was probably the Monday, we went over to Loch Erriboll and climbed up to the southeast of a hill called Ben Arnaboll, which is between Loch Erriboll and Loch Hope. And there is what they call foliated limestone, where it's all cut into slivers. And we were working our way up the valley off Lewisian Nice and waiting to see the signs of the limestone. And there was 100 metres there of base-rich flush, stuffed with yellow saxifrage, which is nice. It's common enough, but it was nice to see it in such quantity. And there were other things there as well, hair sedge, other things that really like it, calcareous. So that was a good day. It was quite a climb up the hill, up a stream, a burn valley from the side, but we had an excellent day there. Gordon, the second week, no, it was the first week actually, Gordon went back part way, he had 3 days with us, and we had a couple of slightly lazy days, one of which was to look at the site of the old sweep net fishery at north of Betty Hill Pier. That fishery was closed in 1992, but it is recorded, if I can find it, where am I? Yes, on the 2nd of July 1962, 979 salmon were taken in the sweep nets, as they're called, at the mouth of that river. No wonder there aren't any there now. That was a while ago, but that was the extent of the salmon fishery in the Neva. That's the mouth of the Neva. We spent 3 to 4 hours just doing about 400 metres of the rocky shoreline. We had quite frequent sit-downs to admire what is probably the best view in the whole of the north of Scotland, and that's from Betty Hill looking across the mouth of the Neva to Torresdale, 2 kilometres of sand backed by sand dunes. It is a marvellous place. Whenever earlier in our travels we had been further east, we used to stop at Betty Hill, get an ice cream, take it down to the pier and sit there and look at that. It is absolutely magnificent. And it goes right the way through from the Neva to the Borgie. And I give you that as landscape picture of the talk. And while we were sitting there on that occasion, a medium-sized, well, large-ish bird of prey came over. Gwen has not forgiven me for doctoring this photograph slightly by over-magnifying it. Anybody like to put a name to that? Yes.
Osprey?
Osprey. There are ospreys in that area. They nest down the bottom of Loch Loyal somewhere, and they're obviously still fishing in the Neva. This I think was the second week. Let's have a look at first. Yes, July, and it's the valley of the Furst. I can't Phurst, which I understand means a harbour. It's a funny sort of harbour when you get to it, but it's one of the nicest valleys I've seen. It's a dead-end road that goes to a very small settlement with 4 or 5 houses. It's a township, and there is 400 metres of this valley with over 100 prostrate juniper trees, which there's one there. I have never seen such a very fine assemblage, and prostrate juniper is the one we get here and is more or less confined to northwest Scotland. Unfortunately, in most places, including Assynt, it's been in landscapes that have been burnt. It just goes up like that. But that appears never to have been burnt, and certainly in historic times. It's getting some cattle grazing, but it was the biggest and most magnificent stand of that rather special tree, flat tree, that I've ever seen. We had lunch overlooking the shore and then got down onto the shore, and there were some grey rosettes there, which we could identify because they were very woolly, but that's the flower. That's another one of the North Coast specialities called Purple Oxytropis, of which a site just to the east of this called Brawl, where there is a weird sort of valley coming in with a rock bridge over it. There are thousands there within about a mile, but it does grow about as far west as Skerrow. It doesn't get to Durness. It's a member of the pea family, and it's a splendid plant. It's a modest size and very, very furry leaf. Purple Oxytropis, and it's a North Coast thing. That is the one named island off the north coast we've not got to. It's called Bursa Island. It's seen from the bottom of the valley there, and it's got a very odd triangular look, which I think is due to glacial debris. In fact, you can see in the background. It would be very difficult to land on, and I don't think anybody's ever been there to look at its natural history. Right, last 3 pictures. Towards the end of our second week, we thought we'd do a little slumming, as we call it, and go and look at the old pier on the western side of the Kyle, where the ferries used to go across before the causeway was put in. and list. We were there for about an hour and a half, knocked up well over 100 species, and in this funny little bit of sandy quarry we noticed a plant with yellow daisy-like flowers. That is so-called common fleabane, and that is the first record for West Sutherland. It's never been found. Okay, it's coming on somebody's tyres, but it's well established, and I haven't seen that plant for 40 years. It's instantly recognisable, but very nice to see. And that's just my finishing slide. I've got one or two words just to finish, which was taken on the summer solstice, Gwen? And there is a name for that feature. It's not a sunset exactly, but it was rather striking. It was taken from just outside the house we were staying in. Could I have the lights on, please? I just want to finish with some thanks. Anybody turn the light on at the back there?
Sorry.
Thank you for listening so patiently. I'm just the storyteller this evening. I also do bookings and things like that, but trail behind the experts and admire their expertise. I just wanted to say these are ventures, and it has been enormous fun. That's why we go on doing it, actually, and we're back again this year. They could not have been enjoyed without the help of a number of other people, and I just wanted to make our thanks to John Burnett of Kempe, who took us out to the islands, out to Fishkill, the McLean family of Borgie for taking us by boat to the islands, Margaret and Ian at Reetung, no longer there unfortunately, who are our hosts for in the Croft Cottage for 9 years and extremely friendly. Ian Smart of Wildland, who provided transport, as you gathered, which enabled us to meet lots of areas that we could never have walked into in the time. And most of all, 5 friends, entomologists Abby and Stephen, who are no longer with us, who added Stephen especially, added a completely new entomological dimension to all our work. Gordon and Rowe, who have returned year after year. Gordon is an international level bryologist, and Rowe a very good mammal person and botanist, and they have brought their particular skills and expertise. And finally, my thanks to Gwen, I'm going to embarrass her here, photographer, expedition photographer, birder, lepidopterist and botanist, whose company, with that of her lovely colleagues Jess and Zara, has made the many hundreds of expeditions that we've shared over the last 10 years both productive and extremely enjoyable. Thank you, Gwen. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Is there any questions, everybody?
We're all beaten into submission. Yeah. No questions? Go on, ask the obvious ones, I don't mind. Why do no, I told you why we do it for fun.
Can I ask,
Yeah.
have you seen changes to the landscape? You talked about like the lack of grazing and the vegetation quite thick. It seemed
That's on the islands.
on the islands, yeah.
Places like that Betty Hill, there were masses of sheep, and so we actually just went along the shore and then looked at some rock outcrops. We haven't been revisiting sites even over 10 years.
Yeah.
Pat and I were there at some of the sites which are SSSIs in the 40s, 02 and 03, but we've not really been back to them. But we keep on finding new ground, and so we go and look at that. Changes would be difficult. I think there is an intensification of agriculture in places. Courtenay is a township which has lost some things to rather more intensive agriculture. And there's some erosion of the SSSI grasslands in places on the coast, quietly going on, but Nature Scott don't have the staff to get out on the ground nowadays. Any other questions? Okay, thank you.
If there's no other questions, Ian, I want to thank you very much. It was a very enjoyable evening. As always, it's been so close to where we are, and yet we go past it, and it's so good to be able to see the detail and just what we miss when we look ourselves, and I keep thinking, oh, what would I have seen that wee wintergreen and things like that. So it's really great for you to come and share all this tonight. So thank you very much, Ian.